Today we are going to revisit 9/11 on the occasion of the 20th anniversary. Our guest today is Larry Parkinson, who is General Counsel of the Federal Bureau of Investigation on 9/11. Larry is a native South Dakotan who graduated from Pier Riggs High School, Northern State University, and Harvard Law School. In the spirit of full disclosure, I should tell you that Larry is my cousin. Our conversation will look at the following: where you were, what you did on 9/11, could 9/11 been prevented? And as a result, what ensued in months after? What did we learn? How did the FBI mission change? As we begin, a little background is necessary. Larry just retired after 40 years of public service with various different agencies of the federal government. Let's start with this. How did you get to the FBI?
Well, back in 1995, I was working at the Justice Department, the U.S. Attorney's Office. I was a federal prosecutor, an assistant U.S. attorney. At that time, I was prosecuting public corruption cases. And I read an article in the Legal Times publication back in the day that had a front page article about the General Counsel at the FBI. And I read this article and I thought, oh my God, that sounds like a fascinating job. I had worked with FBI agents, but I didn't know too many people over there on cases. And so I looked to see if there were any positions being advertised, and sure enough, they were looking for a deputy general counsel. So I applied, and in short order, they selected me to be a deputy general counsel. I started in December of 1995, and then fast forward a little bit, in the middle of 1997, I became general counsel.
So you served a couple of different directors.
Yeah, I was hired by Louis Freeh. He was the director. He started in 1993, appointed by Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton regretted that at times. But anyway, I started with under Louis Freeh, and then I served under Bob Mueller, who began his directorship at the FBI 6 days before 9/11. So he had been on the job just a few days when 9/11 happened. I served under him until the following summer of 2002, when I left for the Interior Department.
It should be noted, of course, that FBI directors have a term. They're nominated by presidents and then serve a 10-year term. So it was the idea when it was first created was so that we wouldn't have a tenure such as J. Edgar Hoover's that went on and on and on forever, and the politics would be taken out of the law enforcement atmosphere at the FBI.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, Bob Mueller was the only director in recent years, since that law was changed, to serve more than 10 years. He actually got another couple of years by statute when his tenure term ended. Congress gave him a couple extra years.
9/11, a day that changed all of our lives to some degree, but let's start. What were you doing on September 10th?
You know, I don't recall what I was doing on September 10th. When I was in that job as general counsel, every day was an adventure. I came to work every day, and sometimes it was the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. And some days were planned, most days, regardless of what had been planned, the day changed. So I don't really remember what I was doing on the 10th. The director had been, as I said, on the job at that time 5 days. So he was getting adjusted to the new position. And I remember coming in on Saturday, that prior Saturday, to have a one-on-one conversation with the director. And I knew him from my days as a prosecutor. So I knew him some, but I was getting to know him at that time.
Just to digress by a minute, the role of the general counsel in the FBI. Let's talk about that for just a little bit.
The general counsel is the top legal advisor to the to the agency. And I would say my job was roughly 50% running a large law office. At the time, I think there were about 85 lawyers who worked for the General Counsel's office, and we had about a similar number of paralegals who handled a lot of stuff. And then I'd say about half of the job was being an advisor to the director. I reported directly to the director, Louis Free first, and then Bob Mueller. We began every morning with about 6 of us in the director's office to talk about what the day was like ahead of us. So half of it was straight legal work, and both managing the office and working with the Justice Department and the intelligence community. And the other half was just advising the director on all of the things that came up in an ordinary week. And most weeks were not ordinary. They were quite extraordinary.
Well, 9/11, an extraordinary day. Starting it out and taking a look, where were you when you first heard that the planes had hit the towers? The first plane had hit the tower.
I was in my office. I had an office on the 7th floor around the corner from the director's office. And I had a TV. I don't recall if I had it on or somebody told me that a plane had hit the tower. So I turned the TV on, if it wasn't already on, and saw the news reporting initially of the first plane. And at that time, they were reporting for the first several minutes that it was a small plane. A small plane had hit one of the towers. So I was monitoring the news coverage for those first few minutes. Nobody was thinking that this was a terrorist act. But shortly after that, obviously, when the second plane hit, that changed everything. And I saw it in real time in my office. At that time, it became pretty clear that we were under attack and this was a terrorist act. So the first thing I did shortly after 9 o'clock that morning was to leave my office on the 7th floor. And this was in the FBI headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. We had a new command center that had just opened not too long before that, a couple of years. So I went to the command center. It was called SIOC, Strategic Information Operations Center, but essentially it was a command center. And there was a room in the command center. It was a pretty big center, but there was a room that was devoted to the director. The director had a small room with glass windows. It was inside the command center. And there was a table that had seats for 10 or 12 folks. So I went to that room, and I knew that things were bad, and I knew that that's where we would be assembling. I didn't have to be told that. I knew that's where we would be. So I went down there. The director was there, and maybe half a dozen other assistant directors. I had my general counsel position was analogous to an assistant director position. At that time, there was the director, the deputy, and then we had like 16 assistant directors. That was the hierarchy. It's a little bit more, there's more levels now, but that's what it was then. So I went down to the command center. The director was already there, as was the deputy director, and the head of counterterrorism, the head of counterintelligence, the head of criminal.
Obviously, the FBI has an office in New York City, and I assume that you probably relied on what little information they had at that particular period of time from a feet on the ground situation.
We did, although the FBI office in New York was pretty close to the towers, and they were having some difficulties with communications. Mm-hmm. But they were obviously at ground zero, so we had an open line to that office, and the information that came in remarkably quickly. There were within within a half an hour. We thought we knew who was behind it. They had already found some stuff, both from airline records and on the scene, that were helping us put it together. We had a whiteboard in the office where the terrorism folks were sketching out who they thought was responsible and what we're going to do. And we had open lines to the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, to see what was going on in the skies.
Well, obviously, the communication between agencies was imperative to have at that point. And I'm sure as the coordination started to go, like coordination with the White House, with other federal agencies that were involved. Could you walk through that just a little bit, how that happens? And, is it instantaneous, or does it take a little while to ratchet up?
It's pretty instantaneous. I mean, we have regular, at the time, and still do, obviously, regular communication channels with the National Security Council at the White House, with the CIA, the NSA, the Justice Department. There were a number of Justice Department folks who came across the street. Justice Department is directly across the street from FBI headquarters, so a number of the senior people from the Justice Department came over. But the communications are pretty instantaneous in terms of connecting with the relevant people. The information was flowing, as you can imagine, through a variety of sources, but it was happening pretty quickly. And then,
well, obviously,
we're getting reports from some were legitimate and some were not. Other attacks. There was supposedly an explosion at the State Department. That was not accurate. There were all kinds of reports coming in, some of which were accurate, some of which were not.
well, it's obvious that the course of the day changed entirely for people in the federal government, especially in an agency like the FBI and other agencies that are involved in this sort of thing. What was the mood in the room?
Incredibly somber. You can see I still get emotional about it 20 years later. It takes me back to those days. There was nothing like seeing those planes get hit, and particularly when the planes fell. It was somber, as you can imagine, serious, and we were just trying to do everything we could possibly think of to get to the bottom of this in short order. And then shortly after, it wasn't that long after that the Pentagon got hit. So we had another event near us. One of the things that I get emotional about is we were on an open line to the FAA, and we're trying to. There was a plane in the air. This was after the Pentagon got hit, and we knew there was another plane in the air that was headed toward Washington, and they were tracking the plane. We were trying to figure out, does anybody have authority to shoot this plane down if it comes to Washington? We were having trouble getting an answer to that question. But they were calling it out. And at one point they said the plane is heading our way. It's 10 minutes out. And then I remember they said it was 7 minutes out. And then it was 5 minutes out. And we were, in the meantime, we had sent all of our employees home, except for the people that needed to be there, because we needed to be conscious of the safety of our own employees. And we also knew that the FBI headquarters is a target. It's certainly wouldn't have been as high on the list as the Capitol or the White House, but it certainly would have been a terrorist target. It would have been harder to hit given its location in downtown Washington than some of the others, but we were very conscious that we may be targeted ourselves. So we'd sent all the employees home. But we got the word from the FAA. We had an open line that the plane was 4 minutes out, and the director I was sitting directly across the table from Director Mueller. He was at one end, I was at the other end, and he looked at me and said, "Say your prayers." Uh, and it was a moment where I thought, wow, I understand instantaneously what duty is all about. When the director of the FBI is looking you in the face and saying, "Say your prayers." Now, it turned out that that information was sort of accurate, but this was the plane that went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. I don't think even at the speed that it was going, it could have reached DC in 4 minutes. But that's what we were hearing, and the FAA was counting it down for us. So that was a moment that I'll never forget.
Yeah, it was an emotional moment for all of us. I had worked in the Capitol building for 10 years previous to 9/11 and had left, shortly before that. And I had that, after Suzanne called me, I was in the office and didn't have the TV on either. I was working downtown near the Navy Memorial on 7th, just a block away from your office, actually. And, the first thing that went on when I turned on was thought about, I hope they got everybody out of the second floor office that I had worked in for the previous 5 years on the west side of the Capitol building, because that obviously appears to be and I get emotional to that day too. But I was not involved at that point. Like I said, I was downtown and in what soon was to become a ghost town, Washington, D.C. at that moment. Yeah. And the other part about it is that during my time at the Customs Service, the regional office of the Customs Service was in the World Trade Center. So I knew people who were there. I knew people who were in the Pentagon. We had neighbors who were there, and so we had our kids, as your kids went to school with kids whose parents were in the Pentagon. And lucky enough, from the Customs Service, because their offices were on the first and second floors, everybody was able to get out of the towers, but it was still a very moving and emotional time from that standpoint. And today I think about it the same way. Yeah. It's one of those things. And as that moved on, and as you had discussions and you found out about Flight 93 going down, and the Pentagon had been hit, and the towers had been hit, what happens at that particular point with FBI as an agency? I know that there are contingencies built into how do you react to stuff, but how do you interact? Number one, how does the agency respond? And then number two, how's the interaction with other federal agencies?
Yeah, the one remarkable thing about the FBI is when it needs to, in a moment of crisis, it can shift gears almost instantaneously. At the time, we had several hundred, I don't remember the exact number, probably around 800 folks who were working on terrorism cases. That day, there were 4,000. Immediately, there were 56 field offices. There still are 56 field offices in the FBI. We immediately began a twice a day phone call with every office in the country, and every office had leads. Leads are, what they sound like. If there was an investigative lead, you would send it to a particular FBI office, and they would track down the lead, whether it was, some suspicious person on another plane, or a relative of one of the hijackers, or you name it. Every office in the FBI around the country, and we at that time I think we had 42 foreign offices, where they're called legal attaches or legats in various countries around the world. They were all engaged as well. But we had at least twice a day. It was led by the deputy director, Tom Picard, at the time. A conference call with every field office, and very crisply, every field office would go down their major leads and tell us what they were learning on a real-time basis. And obviously, Washington was incredibly busy, as was New York. But there there were leads all over the country. And it's easy to think about 9/11 in retrospect, say, okay, well, there were three incidents. There was the World Trade Center, and there was the Pentagon, and then there was the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. But for days, especially that first day, we were getting reports from all over the country about suspicious people on planes, passengers that had box cutters. And then the other piece that was not visible at the time to the outside world is we did a remarkable job as a government getting all the planes out of the air. Took about 2 hours. Every domestic flight was on the ground. But there were international flights, both over the Atlantic and the Pacific, that were inbound. And we were getting throughout the day reports that there may be a hijacking of a plane over the Atlantic who was coming in. There was a report in the afternoon that day of 6 planes coming over the Pacific, and a false report, but a report that the fleet in Pearl Harbor had moved out of Pearl Harbor because there was going to be an attack in Hawaii. So there were, to say that it was a crazy, wild day is an understatement. It wasn't just 3 events. It was information and investigative leads happening all day and for many days after that, before the dust settled.
One of the things that the FBI has always known as a law enforcement agency, but there is an intelligence capability that exists. And could you touch a little bit about how the intelligence situation and law enforcement worked together beforehand and how it evolved afterwards, if it did?
Yeah, I think, and I learned this when I went to the FBI. I thought of the FBI as mostly a law enforcement agency as well. But the day that I set foot in the FBI as an employee in 1995, it became very apparent to me that law enforcement was just one piece of what the FBI does. I spent, as General Counsel, I spent probably more than half of my time on intelligence and national security work than I did on criminal law enforcement issues, because the FBI has and always has had a tremendous component that focuses on national security and intelligence. And anything that happens domestically, the FBI is responsible for that. The CIA and NSA generally can't legally operate inside the United States. So from my very first day on the job, I was working national security cases, and we had a spate of spy cases at that time. My first day on the job, I was working on a spy case involving an FBI agent that was spying for the Russians. This was not Robert Hansen, it was another guy. Hansen came a little bit later. But there was a significant terrorism component of the FBI's work. I use this as an example. As early as 1998, so 3 years before 9/11, and maybe even sooner than that, I had a folder that wide in my safe, a classified folder on bin Laden. At that time, we called him Usama bin Laden. It was USAMA instead of Osama. But we had been tracking and following bin Laden's activities for many years before 9/11. And terrorism was as big a part of the mission of the FBI, counterterrorism, as anything, because we had some serious terrorist attacks, including Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia that killed a number of servicemen. So there was a sense that I bristle a little bit when historians or others say, well, the FBI's mission really changed. It didn't change, but it got bigger, and it Certainly, we changed the law to focus on terrorism in ways that were desperately needed. And we put more and more resources, and the number of agents that were assigned to counterterrorism cases exploded after 9/11. So the resources that were spent on terrorism were vastly expanded.
There's obviously a realignment of certain things and the expansion you mentioned as a result of that. And did, following that, the 9/11 Commission made several recommendations that went through, but I assume that, as you stated, a lot of things changed but didn't change. They just expanded even in a run-up until the 9/11 Commission's report was filed and recommendations was made. Let's talk a little bit about, now it's 9/11, it's 9/12 into the future. Several things happened as a direct result of 9/11. The Congress doesn't always move proactively on things, but they certainly move forward quickly. Some will say that they moved a little too quickly on certain things. They created the Department of Homeland Security. They also changed some other government functions. The Patriot Act was enacted. Could we touch a little bit on that? Because I know you were involved in the writing of the Patriot Act.
Yeah, I was deeply involved in that. It was the Sunday after 9/11. We got a call from the Justice Department. I got a call from the Justice Department, said the White House wants an anti-terrorism bill up on the Hill within a couple of days. And we need you to work up the intelligence pieces of what became the Patriot Act. At the time, we called it the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001. We didn't spend our time trying to figure out a good name for the act. We were focused on substance. But so I gathered my top intelligence, national security lawyer, a guy named Mike Woods, and we spent the rest of the day pulling together the intelligence provisions that eventually became the Patriot Act. We worked directly with the White House and with a couple of folks in the Justice Department. And then for the next month, really, probably 5 weeks, I spent virtually all of my time negotiating, working on what became the Patriot Act. We were up on Capitol Hill, and it was, 7 days a week. Some folks think that the Patriot Act was rushed into place. It was done quickly, but there was a lot of give and take. There were provisions that were taken out, provisions that were put in through any normal legislative process. We had a lot of meetings with the leadership up on the Hill, with the White House, and at the end of the day, there were really some important changes that were made to the legal framework, and particularly relating to information sharing. One of the things that the 9/11 report spends a fair amount of time on is the constraints that were imposed on sharing between the criminal side, meaning people that were doing criminal investigations, and the intelligence side, those working on national security cases. There was what became known colloquially as the wall. There was a wall between law enforcement and intelligence. And there were legal reasons for that. Getting under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, it's a secret, it's a top secret procedure that's not an adversarial proceeding, and the threshold, the legal threshold for getting a surveillance or a search warrant in a national security case was a little different than it was on the criminal side. And because it was secret, the subject of the search or surveillance wasn't aware of it. So it was a very structured process. And one of the things that the Patriot Act did ultimately was to break down some of those barriers and allow better coordination between the intelligence side of the house and the law enforcement side of the house. I, as general counsel, always felt I had two hats. I had a law enforcement hat. I had a intelligence hat. I was working every day with the intelligence community as well as the criminal folks. And so I had visibility into both sides, but not many people did. The intelligence agents didn't interact much with prosecutors and didn't interact much with law enforcement criminal agents.
Unfortunately, that was, I think, a problem throughout most of the federal government law enforcement, that those barriers existed in a lot of agencies. As that, as we move forward from that point and those barriers were taken down, I assume that the job got to a degree harder, but easier because of that coordination that was then taking place. And I know certainly in my experience, changes in the law enforcement field at the federal level don't come easily.
Yeah, I think given the circumstances of 9/11 and the urgency to prevent other terrorist attacks, I think some of those rivalries that might have existed in the past fell by the wayside. It did make things easier, but in one way it made it harder. And that is, people refer to it as looking for a needle in a haystack. And one of our old friends, South Dakotan named John Hamre, he was at the time at the Pentagon as a deputy secretary. John used to say, I'm pretty sure it was John used to say, well, what we're doing here by getting more and more information is we're just making the stack larger and larger and larger. You're still looking for a needle in the haystack, but the haystack is way bigger than it was before. And there's a lot of truth to that, it's easy to say all you need is more information, but more information makes your job really hard. And I think one of the results of that is agencies like the NSA came up with tools to sift through that. New tools, they had tools all along, but tools to sift through all that information, which then led into some legal problems down the road because we were sucking in vast amounts of information as a government and then trying to sort through that.
Yeah, that sounds exactly like John, as I remember from all those years ago, that he would say something like that and be accurate in what he was talking about. Terrorism hasn't gone away, but one would say that we've been quite successful as a result of the lessons learned as a result of 9/11, because we've had no other really foreign attacks upon the homeland, so to speak. And I think, could you address a little bit about that? Because I know there are threats out there, and there have been a lot of times that threats have been stopped because of the investigative work and the intelligence that's been gathered.
Yeah, and some of those attacks got stopped, pretty late in the game at the last minute. You had the shoe bomber out of Boston who got convicted. You had the guy that was coming into Detroit that had explosives in his underwear. I mean, some of those planned attacks came very close to fruition. So we know about some of those because they're public. There's a lot of attacks that have been prevented on the ground overseas in various ways that nobody will ever know about. There are hundreds of those. And a lot of that is due to better information sharing and the government and the folks who work in it, working 24/7 to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And I do think the proof's in the pudding. It's not like people stopped wanting to attack the United States. There were plenty of people out there who, and there still are, who would like nothing better than to carry out a terrorist attack in the United States. And the fact that we haven't had any significant foreign attacks is a tribute to the hardworking men and women who do this every single day.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand is they see the television shows about all of the different federal law enforcement agencies, which kind of glorifies the stuff and everything solved in a few minutes, within 60 minutes on the 45 minutes of airtime with some ads. But it's different than that. The groundwork that is necessary, the really shoe leather work that goes on, and especially now with the intelligence gathering and the tech people who spend endless hours going through mountains of information trying to dig out that one little aspect that could be a lead to go from someplace from that standpoint.
Yeah, and it's also helpful to know, and there's been some discussion about this. There's been a lot of conversation about the president's daily brief or the PDB. This was the case before 9/11. It's certainly been the case after 9/11. Every single day, there are serious threats to the security of the United States. Literally every single day. It's not an exaggeration. Every morning when I was the general counsel, and this occurred long before 9/11, I would get a briefing by the CIA and the NSA about what the threat stream was. And every day there were reports of potential attacks on the United States of various kinds. This was all classified stuff for the most part, and but the task of sorting through all that is a monumental one. You need to know whether there's something imminent, and whether it's a reliable reporting, and sorting that out is an incredibly difficult task. And I would throw in a note about our partnerships with foreign intelligence and law enforcement agencies. We couldn't be as proactive as we are without having built those relationships. Not only the FBI, but CIA and NSA, of course, have had foreign presence since their inception. But the FBI made in the early to mid 90s a concerted effort to build those relationships and build those foreign offices, which allow us to tap into information that other governments are seeing and investigating every day.
You mentioned earlier about the fact that FBI has 56 domestic offices, and not all terrorism is foreign. Not all terrorism threats to the United States are foreign. There are domestic terrorism threats that exist out there. Were the capabilities learned on? And now I know those offices were doing that work before, but because of the learning experience as a result of 9/11, are those now being applied? Those sorts of lessons learned being applied in different ways domestically than they were before?
I think a lot more attention is being given than it had been. But you don't have an Oklahoma City, which occurred well before 9/11, without the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies focusing on domestic terrorism. So sometimes we forget that we had major domestic terrorism incidents even before 9/11. So that capability had been beefed up, and the importance of it was always understood. The one thing that I think was a shift after 9/11, and it wasn't a huge shift, but it was a more visible one, and that is the focus on prevention. When I say it wasn't a huge shift, FBI and other agencies clearly understood the need to prevent, especially terrorism acts before they occur. So it wasn't like anybody was sitting around waiting for the act to occur. But there was a much more concerted and focused commitment to prevention as opposed to investigating criminally an act that had already occurred. And one of the interagency approaches after 9/11 was a conscious decision to potentially compromise criminal cases if we could prevent an attack. And by compromising, I just mean the focus is on prevention. It's not about making sure that all your T's are dotted and all your I's are crossed in order to prosecute somebody after an act occurred. My predecessor at the FBI and the General Counsel's name Howard Shapiro. Had an interesting approach to this that I adopted. They had a conference. CIA and FBI had a conference in Rome back in 1996, and it was interesting because there was a room full of stuff. Literally, it was just a room full of stuff. And the CIA wanted it, said we really need it for intelligence purposes. The FBI said, no, we need to have custody of it because we may have prosecutions that come out of this stuff that was found, and it was a terrorism case. And finally, Howard stood up and said, look, let's just stop calling it evidence or intelligence. It's just stuff. We want the stuff. You want the stuff. And we got to figure out how to cut through this so that we can share this stuff. And that was one of my first tasks when I came in as Deputy General Counsel. We did a room full of stuff, and it was pretty simple. I worked with a counterpart at the CIA. We worked up a 3-page document that says, when we find information, this is how we're going to share it. And in that case, the solution was embarrassingly simple. It was like, well, let's copy the stuff. It was documents. So okay, let's copy it. The CIA, and give the copy to the CIA. They don't care about the integrity of the documents. We'll give the originals to the FBI in case criminal cases develop. And they have the information that they need to do their jobs. In the meantime, we share this stuff. And there are simple solutions to some of this stuff, some of these things that we came across along the way. And we tried to keep it simple and share as much as we could whenever we could.
Backing up a moment to the evening of 9/11 and the night of 9/11, did you go home?
I went home around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Just to shower and come back and just to check on the family. I think I was able, as I recall, the first 3 days, 3 or 4 days, I was in the office pretty much all the time. And the only time I went home was to shower and maybe try to get an hour's worth of sleep. So I did make it home that night for an hour or so. And it was kind of surreal because the Pentagon, as you recall, Chuck, the Pentagon was on fire for several days. And you and I both came home from DC down 395, Interstate 395. And, you're driving past a terrorism scene. I mean, literally, it's a stone's throw from the highway, and it's on fire. The Pentagon is burning as I'm going to and from the office. So added a certain amount of urgency and poignancy to it as well.
Yeah, that sticks in my mind as well as that drive by the first day when I drove home on 9/11 by, and the firehouse, heavy it was, and it continued for several days thereafter. You and I both had younger kids. Yours are a little older than mine at that time, but how did your discussion with them? They didn't see much of you for those first 4 or 5 days. And I'm sure they were wondering what you were up to, and how did you approach talking to them about what had happened?
Well, an interesting question. Yeah, my son was in 10th grade, so he was in high school. My daughter was in 6th grade. And they're close enough. They were both of their schools are close enough to the Pentagon that they felt it. they felt it in the classroom when the plane hit the Pentagon. Um, and I was up to my eyeballs, so I think I was able to call home. My wife, if fortunately or unfortunately, she had broken her ankle a couple of days before. She felt twisted it on some stairs and was laid up. So in one respect, that was good because she was home and she could be home with the kids when they eventually got home. They were held in school for hours, and depending on what class they were in, kids got better information or more information than others. But they were old enough that they were able to, watch TV and learn what was happening, and they certainly understood what my job was, and that was, mom was going to take care of them at home, and dad was going to be at work, doing everything he could to respond to this and to make sure that something else didn't happen. So, they kind of understood what my job was. I had been in the job. I'd been at the FBI by then for 6 years, and I'd been general counsel for 4. So they knew that when there was a national emergency of whatever kind, I would be occupied. I have another story which I won't get into, but when we took down Robert Hansen, the FBI who was spying for the Russians, I was at my daughter's 10th birthday party. They were playing laser tag with 25, 30 other people. And he actually got arrested sooner than we had planned. So I had to wrap up the party real quick so I could get down to the command center. Anyway, that's a different story.
Whole different story. One of the things that has happened as we move to wrap up a little bit here, that there's always been a conversation since 9/11 about balancing individual liberties with versus national security. Thoughts, because I know of your involvement in this, that it's a question that you had to do a balance beam walk on to get to that answer.
Yeah, that really is the critical question, and it was before 9/11, but it certainly was brought home by 9/11, and all of the discussion we've had for the last 20 years. It's how do you have a free society and balance civil liberties and freedom with security, and it's not an easy balance for the people who are involved in the security business. They have one approach, and for those people who are focused on civil liberties, they have a completely different approach and don't trust the federal government in a lot of ways, and it's a real challenge to find the right balance. I will say I think the Patriot Act got kind of a bad rap. Patriot Act found that balance. There's a reason that it passed with only one person voting, one senator on the Senate side voting no. And it was a balance that was achieved through weeks and weeks of discussions about, okay, what is this balance? How do we improve our ability to gather information and to surveil potential bad guys, but not infringe too much? Finding that balance is really the job of all of us as Americans, to figure out how do we protect ourselves, but still maintain enough civil liberties and freedom that we don't have unnecessary government surveillance or unnecessary government actions. I've spent 40 years in the federal government, so it always amazes me how folks will trust Facebook or Google to look at their information, but there's this inherent distrust of the federal government, and folks who are stretched so thin, that they're doing their best, and the last thing in the world they want to do or have any inclination to do is to try to unnecessarily interfere in people's civil liberties. But but it's an important issue, and it's one that we began talking about with civil liberties groups within a month or two of 9/11. Director Mueller invited folks in, and we had a lot of discussions about that. And the more information you gather, the more secure you're going to be generally. But the more information you gather makes people very nervous about whether the government is overreaching. And there were controversies, as folks learned in the mid 2000s, about how much information we were collecting as a government and what it was being used for. And it's really critical to make sure that everybody is focused on that question, and also that we have appropriate court oversight to keep things in the right balance, and to have Congress do its job, which is not always assured.
Having worked there for many years,
Yeah.
I can well understand that observation. Let me, on something you just touched about on that, if you could leave a thought with the people of South Dakota about how government works in this particular area, taking a look at all of the things we've talked about today. And you could go on for probably a long time, but in a short paragraph, are there any words that you'd like to leave with the people of South Dakota about the way the government works to help, in these activities?
I would say, having seen it up close and personal for decades, all I can say is the people that are doing these jobs, meaning whether they're working at CIA or NSA or FBI or Customs or you name it, they're trying to do the right thing, and they're not. There's too much work to do to be gratuitously spying on Americans who are just going about their business. This is very, very serious work. The threats are there every single day, and the idea that government servants, public servants, are engaged in rooting around for some odd reason into people's private affairs when there's no good reason to do so has always bothered me a little bit, because I know how conscientious everybody is. I know how overworked they are. They have these haystacks full of information that they need to sift through every single day, and they're doing their best to do it under the laws that Congress provided. And there have been missteps. There have been occasions where government agencies, including the FBI, have made missteps and overstepped their authority or done things incorrectly under the law. And we have a pretty good apparatus in place, from inspectors general to congressional oversight to the press, to make sure that when those things happen, they're discovered and they're corrected. But for the most part, these are real American heroes who are doing their job every day to keep everybody safe, and also to protect civil liberties. And it's a hard balance to figure out.
We've talked about a lot of things. Is there anything we missed that you think we ought to touch on?
No, I think we've done a pretty good job of covering the landscape. 9/11 is one of those events that, for those of us who lived through it, will forever be seared in our memories and in our hearts.
Well, Larry, thanks. I appreciate your time, your insight, your descriptions of what happened. And I hope that when people see and listen to this, they will take to heart some of the things that you said, and just a little better explanation of things they may not have known about. So thanks a lot. And hopefully we will be able to get together again and not have to talk about issues like 9/11.
Yeah, sounds good. It was a pleasure, Chuck.